The Titanic is remembered in many ways. This mural is in a shopping centre in Hanley, Stoke-on-Trent, the birthplace of Edward John Smith, the captain of the Titanic. There have been many maritime disasters, but somehow there's something special about the Titanic. Its myths, its legends, and a story that seems to grow with every retelling. Of course, the basic facts of the ill-fated maiden voyage are well documented and well known. The White Star Liner Titanic, the largest ship of her day, left Southampton on her maiden voyage on April the 10th, 1912, with 1,308 passengers and 898 crew. She was called a floating palace, the epitome of luxury, and her passenger list boasted every class of person, from millionaires and society's elite down to humble emigrants to the New World. But the hopes and lives of many were cut short when she collided with an iceberg and sank in the early hours of April 15th. The Cunard liner Carpathia was first on the scene by early morning to pick up those people, mainly women and children, still alive in the lifeboats, and to take them on to New York. There were 705 survivors. There were 2 inquiries into the disaster. The American inquiry put the blame on J. Bruce Ismay, managing director of the White Star Line, the high speed, and the lack of enough lifeboats. The British inquiry blamed the speed, lack of lifeboats, and Captain Edward John Smith. After the sinking, transatlantic liners travelled further south to avoid the ice, travelled slower, and carried lifeboats sufficient for all on board. A recent inquiry blamed the captain of the Californian, only 19 miles from the Titanic, for failing to respond to the Titanic's distress rockets and attempt to rescue, even though it accepted that she couldn't have arrived before the Carpathia because of intervening ice. So, the Titanic is still news, and still controversial. But her story goes beyond the mere facts. It's the myths, the legends, the personal memories and associations which are just as much a part of her story.
This is the actual dock that the Titanic did sail from. We're just coming into the position where the St. Louis, the Philadelphia and the Majestic were all tied up together because of the coal strike. Coal was taken from all 3 ships to feed the Titanic so that she could make her maiden voyage. With that red and white box on the quay, that's just about where the bow of the Titanic would have been. The bollards that you've tied up to are exactly the same ones. They've never been changed since 1912. They've done yeoman service over the years, many, many ships, and seen many, many stories. So at 12 o'clock, April the 10th, 1912, this is where the Titanic would have slipped her ropes, tugs would have gathered her up, and taken her straight out to sea. As you know, she had a little mishap on the way, which I'll explain when we get nearer.
Well, for the first time for probably many years, not only did Southampton Maritime Museum have many of their rare items on view, private collectors came along and included family memorabilia, telegrams which we didn't even know existed, have now been seen today. Yesterday we had a very, very satisfactory and a very large crowd. In fact, it exceeded our expectations. I think there must have been something like 2,000 people passed through for those few hours. And they were able to see items which they may never, ever see. So really, it's a once-in-a-lifetime experience.
Well, 80 years, of course, is fantastic, you know. And the weather-wise is super. So it's been a weekend to remember.
It's lovely weather down here in Southampton. We've just done a cruise around the original harbour where the Titanic sailed from. We've been in the Maritime Museum, and there's about 150 members here from all over the world.
We've really enjoyed this weekend. I'm really glad we came now. And I'm glad we joined this society too.
I don't think anybody ever expected the numbers that have come today. I certainly didn't. I didn't even realise there was a society, so I plan to join now. So.
It's incredible that anything is remembered after 80 years, and there is a definite affection, feeling about the Titanic. It's a story that's growing year by year, and you've only got to look at our convention this year to see the popularity of it, the fascination with this ship, with the luxury, the period, and after 80 years, it's nice that people can get together and meet as friends and talk about a subject like this.
I know my maternal grandfather was actually on the dockside when she left. He was secretary of the Union Castle Line in Southampton. And my dear Aunt Lily, who's aged 94, her father was a ship's engineer with the America Line on the SS St. Louis. And he got the post of an engineer officer on board Titanic. And he had a premonition of disaster. And he decided not to make the trip, and so, of course, he lived to tell the tale.
My mother had this dreadful premonition. She'd never had one before, and she never had one after. But she said, no, we can't do this. It's quite wrong. Something dreadful will happen. And I tell you, what the sort of woman she was. She'd got both feet on the ground, and for her to behave like that was absolutely unbelievable to everyone. But she just had that premonition.
I went up the gangway on the Titanic, and I looked up at it. I said to my father, what a big ship it is. I said, and as we went up the gangway, my father turned white. My mother asked if he was ill. He said, no, he was all right. Well, we went up to our cabin. Then we took our coats off and stood over the rail, looking at the people below. It was a boat called the New York. She nearly ran into the Titanic, nearly covered the collision. And my father turned round and said, that's a bad omen.
If Captain Gale on one of the tugs hadn't been such a fine seaman and prevented collision, or potential collision, when the SS New York double berthed for the Oceanic, and the largest ship in the world as she then was, 46,000 tons, as she went by, tremendous undertow, pulled the ship into the part, almost a collision. Captain Gale, with brilliant salvage, got his tug in position and saved the collision. And if it had been me in charge, and if there'd been a collision, then the sailing could have been delayed another 12 hours, 24 hours, and she wouldn't have been in that place at that time. There were all these little factors which together led to this tragedy. Then we had this ridiculous ruling by the Board of Trade at the turn of the century. It said that any ship of 10,000 tons should have 16 lifeboats, totally ignoring the fact that the ship was 46,000 tons, but in law still only needed 16 lifeboats. So you see that from that tragedy we then had every ship had sufficient lifeboats for the number of passengers. We had ice patrols, international cooperation. You could say they perhaps didn't die in vain because they made sea travel much safer for future passengers.
I saw Captain Smith. I spoke to him. My father spoke to him. He came on deck and he was speaking to my father. I was standing alongside of him, and my father was telling him what a beautiful ship it is, and Captain Smith was telling him about it. He was a dear old man, ever such a nice fellow.
I've met him, I should think, perhaps 3 or 4 times. I only remember that my father spoke to him several times, and a couple of times I was with my father, and he took us somewhere. I'm quite sure it wasn't the bridge, but he took us somewhere which was where passengers didn't normally go. But I, of course, wasn't a bit interested at 7 years of age. But he was very nice, I remember that, and he greatly admired a doll I had. He was very nice to me.
On April the 14th, the Titanic received ice warnings through the day and evening over the telegraph, but continued at virtually full speed, 21 knots. At 11:30 p.m., an iceberg was spotted dead ahead, but the chief officer's evasive action caused that iceberg to rip a 300-foot gash below the waterline from the bows along the starboard side. This went beyond the forward watertight compartments whose design led to the Titanic being called Unsinkable and made the sinking inevitable. The world's first SOS distress call was sent from the telegraph room. The lifeboats were ordered to be lowered just after midnight, but there were only 16 of them, and although this was the legal requirement, too few to save more than a third of those on board. The last lifeboat was in the water by 2 o'clock, leaving 1,500 people on board to perish, and the Titanic finally sank at 2:20 a.m.
My father went down. He went down with Reverend Carter, a parson who was on board on the deck, you know. Before that, I stood on deck and I said to my dad, look, I said, there's lights over there, a ship is coming to our rescue. And he didn't, the next minute the lights went out. We were left in the dark. So it was only the three of us on the boat deck, and they gradually became in from the third, broke French, I believe, and managed to get out where the first class were, because they were overcrowded by the time they got time to look for a boat. Because some of the young men, I believe, I was told, they were playing with ice, having a good time. They little didn't think anything was going to happen. They kept saying, it's unsinkable, they kept saying. She'll never sink. But you can't do anything about it. She had a great hold, so the water went in. We had, but all the time we stood on the boat deck, she was sinking, and we didn't feel it, because she went head first down in first class, and the other part was still up, and we had to get into the lifeboat.
Well, I have a recollection of being absolutely petrified on a dark night with a sinking ship and people screaming. There wasn't any panic until the lifeboats left, and then there was panic galore. We were down on the ocean. We could hear them running about on the decks and screaming. You can imagine people came up from their cabin, went onto the deck, no lifeboat, tearing around the other side. That's when the panic was there. There wasn't any panic at the time I got in the lifeboat because there weren't enough people up there. And there were enough people there to just get into the lifeboats. But after that, when the others started coming up from their cabins and there were no boats, gosh, there was panic. We could hear it. Definitely. But the most dreadful sound of all is the sound of people drowning. The screams. Absolutely ghastly. My mother used to say sometimes, she couldn't get me to talk about it for years, but if ever anyone did talk to me, I said that, she used to say yes. But do you remember the silence that followed it? And that's quite right. It says the whole world stood still that night. Once the lights had gone, the ship had gone, the sound had gone. Oh, it was dreadful. Dreadful.
We were lucky. We had a nice lifeboat to get into. The other boat we had to get on 3 hours, we had to wait to get picked up. And another, the Carpathia was it, picked us up. We had to put children in bags and stuff, and I had to climb the ladder to go up. I remember that quite well.
And we were picked up, as you know, in the morning by this little ship, the Carpathia. And so they opened a sort of, I don't know whether the word is right, a hatch in the side of the ship where the luggage used to be laid. And they threw down rope ladders, and people like my mother and other grown-ups had to climb up in mid-ocean up a swaying rope ladder, which she said was the most terrifying thing. A sailor behind sort of holding on. And then what can the children do? We couldn't climb up a rope ladder. So they got these big luggage nets, and the mesh is very wide apart. It's quite a big mesh. Children would have slipped through it, small children. Anyway, our legs and feet would have gone through. So each child was put in a sack. And I remember being petrified when I was put in that sack and it was tied around, and the sack full of these children were put into these huge nets, and quite safely, of course, hauled aboard.
My name's Grace Richards, and my husband was a survivor. As a little boy, aged 3. In fact, the exhibition now, there is a large picture of him taken in the sack that was thrown down from the Carpathia into the lifeboats that the children were put in and then hauled aboard. And there he is standing in his little sack. So I've lent it to the exhibition so that, you know, people can see and be interested. So there was his mother, his grandmother, an aunt and uncle that were brother and sister of his mother, and then there was him, aged 3, and his brother, aged 10 months. And all of them, bar the uncle, were saved in lifeboat 13. And all through his life, he found number 13 very, very lucky.
My mother worked in a high-class confectioner's in Foregate Street, Worcester, and she fell in love with the owner, which was my father. And my father was married and lived in the Malvern shop, over the Malvern shop, and they decided to make a life in another world in San Francisco, California. And so he sold the 2 shops in Worcester, one in Bank Street, one in Foregate Street. He sold the 2 shops in Birmingham, and he gave the shop in Malvern to his wife, and quite a sum of money because he was nearly a millionaire. And they went on the Titanic, to make matters worse, in the assumed name of Marshall. How, I don't know, because I'm from the passport office in London and I don't quite know how that's happened. And of course my father went down with the boat. My mother was saved, and she was on the last lifeboat, number 13, and she was in the water in the boat 8 hours, and the Carpathia picked them up.
Well, my father was a chief steward on there, and he came off on the last lifeboat. We've been showing telegrams, you know, some from America to say that he was safe, others from Plymouth to say that they'd arrived there, and keys to the Veranda Cafe.
I'm the niece of a survivor who was crossing on the Titanic at the age of 19. She was going to work in America as a secretary. And I'm not sure which lifeboat she was actually in, but the family story goes that just as they were leaving, a baby was thrown into her arms, and she looked after the baby until they were rescued by the Carpathia. And I'm not sure how true this is, but it seems that the baby had lost both parents and was due to inherit a great fortune. And when they got to America, the other relatives of the child didn't want to know it.
My grandfather went down on it, and I was told this as a boy in the town where I came from, Poole, Dorset, that he went down. His name was Shannon. He came from Queenstown, County Cork, which is now called Cove. When I inquired into his place on the boat, on the passenger list, there was no name of Shannon. Last year I went back to Poole. My uncle told me he changed his name to Leonard, L. Leonard.
And I lost my grandfather on the Titanic. He was a fireman on board, and his name was Charles Middlecombe. He was originally born in Leicester, and there was a recession in the early part of the century, and he came to Southampton to seek work in the dockyard. His first job was a labourer in the dockyard. I don't know, there's a lorry driver or something like that he was. And then he signed on board the Titanic, but he forged his age to get onto the ships because he wasn't old enough. And then he lost his life at sea with it. He went down on board. And I believe he was working down below when it went down. He hadn't got a chance of being saved. And his son, which is my dad, he was on the Olympic.
I told you yesterday that many Southampton people had relatives on the Titanic. Well, I've just been... I told you yesterday that many Southampton people had relatives on the Titanic. Well, I've just been passed a little note now from our captain, who says that his uncle, Tom Knowles, sailed on the Titanic and happily survived. He was on the liner Mexican, because it was a passenger and cargo ship, and he left to join the Titanic. He was a chief stoker, and what he did was the dockhead jump, which in 1912 meant that you came down with all your gear, sat alongside the gangplank, and just hoped, that there was going to be a place for you on the ship if the members of the crew that had been engaged didn't turn up. In this case, somebody didn't turn up, so he went and sailed on the Titanic. His wife didn't even know that he'd sailed on her until after she had sunk.
Captain Smith, Edward Smith. He was a great uncle. Because, of course, my mother knew him very well, and we heard all about him being children. So, of course, right from being children, we've always been very interested.
My husband's right in the key position at the front there with his cine camera. I'm here because my husband is very keen on the Titanic and the story, and so I come along with him to enjoy the weekend here. And this is a very historic moment, isn't it?
My name's Colin Westland Garnett, which I'm afraid is rather a mouthful, and we are from northeast Aberdeenshire. My uncle, James Fraser, was the third engineer on the Titanic. The significance between Aberdeenshire and Southampton is that the family, as families did, living together in those days, all moved down in 1908. My grandfather was masterman, and he was sailing out of Malaysia. So when James joined the White Star, the whole family came into Southampton, you see. He was brought across from New York, specially, as you know. To get onto the Titanic was a very prestigious situation, and he was brought back specially for this. They were all, I understand, overqualified. Now, the astonishing to me, I mean, this is obviously not only a bit of history, very significant history, it's also very much a bit of family history, as you'll appreciate. James Fraser, the third engineer on the Titanic, he went down at the age of 29. 30 years later, his son, with the same name, the same age, was torpedoed on convoy duty and went down almost at the identical situation, the identical position in the Atlantic. I find this quite remarkable.
My name's Martin, my middle name is Lightoller, final name is Smith, and Commander Lightoller was my mother's second cousin. In other words, it was her father's brother. And I did meet him. I was very young at the time, and I've always followed the story. I've always been interested in it. I passed the name on to my young son as well as his middle name. And I think the thing that I remember most was the method of his survival, because he was a Christian Scientist. My mother is a Christian Scientist, and the belief of the Christian Science is that your body is above your spirit. And when the Titanic went down, he was apparently sucked. He jumped overboard as it slid down. He was apparently sucked towards the funnel, and as the water reached the engines, so it created an enormous explosion, it blew him out. And he was in those waters for 20 minutes or so before he was rescued. And he puts down his survival to this belief in Christian Science, and he was able to float, his body, able to float above the water and ignore the pain. So that's one of the things I do remember most.
I have something in common with a couple of people here, that I'm also a survivor of another shipwreck, which was the Herald of Free Enterprise, with a loss of life, 193. Quite a big proportion of the crew, 50%, died on that night, the same as the Titanic in Southampton here. A lot of the crew perished on that night. I once spoke to Bertram Dean, I met in London, and I said to him, have you coped over the years? Did you suffer in any way, or did it keep you have nightmares or anything like this? Because I wanted to foresee my own future, if you like. And he said, I don't know. He said, I was only 2 at the time, I can't remember a thing about it. So really, I believe that I sort of remember it, I recall it quite often really, and I suppose in a fitting way, it's my own. It's part of remembering the crew and passengers on the day in question really. So, which now over a period of years since the Herald was capsized, I've come to terms with it.
She went grey, her hair went grey overnight pretty well, and she was 19. My aunt herself would never, ever talk about the Titanic, and she wouldn't help when they were making the film. She didn't want to know any more about it at all.
There have been many films made of Titanic, and this one with Clifton Webb and Barbara Stanwyck and a very young Robert Wagner was made in the 1950s. It was a fair success, but it was nowhere near as successful as the next one, which is A Night to Remember, the very famous one by Walter Lord. This is probably the most famous film ever made and will probably remain so. Walter Lord had great access to, I think it was over 60 survivors, and their recollections that he used for the book helped obviously with the book itself, but they were also used, or a lot of them were used as technical advisors in the film itself to ensure accuracy. Even today, I mean, this film is an amazing film when you look at it. My children and I love it. I think the main interest in Titanic has been the mystique. And when Dr. Ballard found the ship, some of the mystique was gone. People seemed to expect to see her sitting bolt upright on the seabed with all her funnels, which of course is ludicrous. But then they found her in two pieces, which proved parts of some of the witnesses' accounts of the time, who said that she went in half, and most people didn't believe that either. Since Ballard has found her, more and more people, I find, have got interested, especially younger people. Children are doing projects all over the world, both here, America, Canada, all over the place, on Titanic. We find we get people approaching us from schools, literally worldwide, for just information on the ship, which is one of the reasons we did the book, so that the school libraries especially can refer to the book with all the newspaper accounts, instead of spending a long time doing research at various libraries. But it's a wide age group. It literally covers people from, I don't know, children from 3 or 4 years old that watch A Night to Remember or something like that, up to adults in their 70s, 80s, some of who can actually recollect seeing the ship sail down Southampton Water. The interest is tremendous. It varies literally from books, films, newspapers, music, Chinaware, to collecting people's personal accounts and collecting signatures of the survivors on postal covers, postcards and things like that. The interest has grown so much over the last few years that there are one specialist auctioneer in London who have annually a Titanic sale, and that creates tremendous interest, a lot of media attention as well. We find, because our shop is in Northern, which was one of the main areas of the crew members, or where the crew members lived, that we get quite a lot of people coming in just for a chat, and they say, oh, my great-uncle was on the Titanic, or my grandfather was on the ship, and some were saved, some went down with the ship. And we can guarantee, I should think, at least once a month, somebody fresh comes in and is associated with Titanic. The classic one is the lady who came in one day and said that she has a set of Titanic Chinaware, a tea set. I didn't believe her. She described the china, and then it turned out that her parents ran a guest house in Southampton. Some of the Titanic's crew, especially the petty officers and officers, were billeted with various families or hotels and places like that. And the second steward, in this case, took the family on a tour of the ship. The mother commented about how nice the china was, and just before Titanic sailed, a box arrived with the tea service. And the tea service is still here, somewhere in Northern, within a mile or so of where we're standing today, all wrapped up. And hopefully, it's the kind of thing that ought to go into a museum. Southampton Museum have got a good collection of Titanic items. It varies from Captain Smith's items. It varies from Captain Smith's sword to, you know, personal things from some of the survivors and some of the crew members who went down with the ship. Very good, interesting collection down there.
The watch.
The watch, and that's your father?
Yes, and that was the telegram Mother received to confirm that he hadn't been saved. He was one of those that happily, as they thought, transferred from the Olympic to the Titanic, which was in effect, you know, the prestige ship, of course, of the day, and a lot of them did have reservations about the Olympic, because she'd had one or two accidents, and in fact I got a letter written only in January 1912 where she damaged a propeller, and of course to get on the Unsinkable Titanic was really something. It was just ironic it didn't work out that way, but we tried to find out the time from the hands. It would seem that he went in the water about 10 to 2, that's how I've worked it out, and his body was found, according to Mother's story, by fishermen, and they buried him at sea, of course, and sent all the effects back, which Mother had, which came in my possession when she died. She lived to 86. And so I felt, you know, it'd be nice to donate it here where I knew they had an exhibit. And I'm even more pleased since I've come to this convention because people are so genuinely interested and they're getting a lot of pleasure out of seeing these things. So it's really nice to know that, you know, people are getting this satisfaction.
They tend to want something actually from the ship, which is virtually impossible. Now, although Titanic was in port for a few days, she wasn't open to the public. There weren't tours around her like there were a lot of the ships. So most of the stuff that has come off the ship has been pinched by crew members or VIPs. You know, they go on board for a souvenir, exactly the same as they do on Q2 or Canberra these days, and they come off with a menu or, you know, something like that, or a box of matches. And those are the things that are actually genuinely from the ship. But of course, a lot of the stuff is just stamped White Star Line. So, you know, you can't always prove the provenance of it. But the majority of people just want some small memento. So that's one reason why a local company has had the enterprise to make some special commemorative souvenirs.
I can remember the sister ship Olympic, of course, as a small boy being taken down at the pier at Southampton and watching these magnificent liners coming up Southampton water. And I think, you know, it all started from that, and the fascination of the story and the tragedy and how it deeply affects Southampton, where, of course, I was born. And so 10 years ago, on the 70th anniversary, I actually commissioned Lawrence Bagley, a very famous watercolourist, to commission a painting to commemorate the 70th anniversary.
A lot of the people collect postcards, and again, the original Titanic ones are quite expensive. We've had a couple made, limited edition ones of our own, but there are a lot on the market that have been reproduced from original photographs. The Ulster Folk Museum in Belfast, they did quite a good selection. One of the things a lot of people like are pictures of Titanic. Now, in 1912, just after she sank, the entrepreneurs turned out all kinds of prints. This particular one is a 1912 print. Although it says a Titanic, ostensibly it's Olympic. The two ships were virtually identical, but the promenade deck on Titanic was enclosed. The entrepreneurs at the time didn't realize, or didn't particularly bother, that when you looked at a ship broadside, the two of them were very slightly different. So they tended to use Olympic on nearly all the Titanic items, apart from the original photographs. This is a hand-tinted print of her, designed to be sold probably for about 3 or 4 pence. In old money, not the modern money. Just to raise money for themselves, usually. Some were sold on behalf of the relief funds, but these particular ones were purely commercial. This one is an actual photograph of Titanic. again made within a few days of the actual sinking, and it shows her just leaving Southampton Water. These are far more sought after than the previous type, which are basically artist impressions. This print was made in 1983 and shows the Titanic sinking. The artist, Chris Major, has a little bit of license showing the ice floes, which weren't around at the time. Superb print, and has been used as a jigsaw puzzle and a book jacket as well. Coming up to date, this one by Simon Fisher shows Titanic just leaving Southampton. Simon also has done another Titanic at Queenstown, Lusitania, Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth, and a couple of other more modern ships. But this one is superb. It really gives an idea of the size of the ship. This print is by Ken Marshall, the noted American marine artist. As far as I'm concerned, it's the most stunning print of Titanic that's ever been done. It shows her with all her power and grace going at full speed, which is between 21 and 22 knots through the Atlantic.
I like the way she sits out of the water. She sits proud. She sits nice and high. The funnels are nice and high, and that's exactly how a ship of this magnitude, it gives the magnitude of the ship in the water, and it does, I think, portray the ship well. I've seen many paintings of the Titanic, and I've yet to see a stern painting of the Titanic be portrayed so well.
I'm Joyce Watson from Leicester, and my grandson James is the one who's interested, and I've done the painting for him for his 15th birthday, which is next Friday, Good Friday. These are some of that's one of his drawings, and these are some pictures that he's done on computer.
Well, what these are, computer-drawn images, which is done with a mouse, which is like a hand-controlled thing. And you move it around and it creates the image on the screen.
A lot of drawings, very, very interested in it. And I think it's rubbed off on me. I'm come as interested as he had.
I worked in Southampton Shipyard all my working life, and I'm very interested in the history of the old liners, and most of the pictures I've got today come from Southampton, and they're all to do with ship repair and collisions of the White Star Line. These photographs are taken by Max Mills, the Southampton photographer, and they're taken at Ocean Terminal from where the Titanic sailed, and they were taken after she came back from the Isle of Wight. She had a collision with the cruiser, HMS Hawke, and as you can see, the damage was quite severe, and this actually fated the Titanic because the ship had to go back to Belfast for repairs, and this took approximately 4 weeks, and during that time the men had to leave the Titanic work and go on to the Olympic, and this caused a delay in the sailing of the Titanic, which should have been in March, but it was delayed until April, and the rest is history. That was caused the damage.
My interest in the Titanic is general, really, but increased by my brother junking this particular 10-inch 78 record at a car boot sale, and I realised that we had something of great value. And we played it several times. Thank goodness I had a 78 deck, and then just let it rest.
It was the cry of the ship going down.
Sheet music was the popular entertainment of the time. Although they had 78 RPM records, music was much more affordable and many more people could use it. As far as we know, there are about 40 different pieces of sheet music relating to Titanic.
This statue is in Colne, in Lancashire, and commemorates Wallace Hartley, the band leader of the Titanic.
We don't get many heroes in Colne, but I do think that Wallace was one of them, and I think he should be remembered as such. How many people or men, should I say, would have stayed at his post as a ship was sinking underneath him. He tried to calm the passengers who were coming near to the stage of panic, and he tried to calm them with his music, and so did the rest of the band, for that matter. There we have a scene outside the top of Skipton Road Primitive Church, going along towards Colne Cemetery of the Wallace Hartley funeral, and that depicts two trams along Keighley Road with the people lining the streets at either side, and on that day above 40,000 people were in Colne, and there has never been as many people in Colne since that day in 1912.
This is rather an interesting violin. It was made about 300 yards up the road from here, up in Colne, by Seth Lancaster, who was a friend of Wallace Hartley's, and commemorates the musicians on the Titanic. If you look on the fingerboard here, we see engraved the start of the hymn, Nearer My God to Thee, which is supposed to have been played as the ship went down, and on the back we have an oil painting of Wallace Hartley, and above it another one of the Titanic. The violin is known as the Titanic violin.
This is number 92 Greenfield Road, Colne, the house where Wallace Hartley was born on the 2nd of June 1878. This is the cemetery, Colne Cemetery, where Wallace Hartley was laid to rest on the 18th of May 1912.
This is the hymn service for Sunday, April the 21st, 1912, for the loss of the White Star Liner Titanic in Southampton. Most of the big churches around here tended to have a special memorial service, as did the larger churches like St. Paul's in London and a lot of the other big ones in different cities. The loss of life for the crew was unbelievable. It was very, very high.
This is the memorial to the crew of the Titanic, and it was put up by the widows, the mothers, and the friends of the men who died. Now, it hadn't used to be here. It used to be out in the open in Southampton Common, but unfortunately it got vandalised, and they brought it here to the grounds of Holyrood Church in Southampton for safekeeping. Now, the urn that you see here has been replaced, but one of the good things about this is when they cleaned it up, the detail of the ship, of the Titanic, up at the top, was revealed in spectacular detail.
As I thought about commemorating such an event, while I recognize the interest that you all have in this ship and the events surrounding her launch, her voyage, and her sinking, as rector of this city, one of the first things that I learnt when I came here was that here in my parish, in the section of the city known as Northam, there wasn't a single family who didn't lose somebody in that accident. And so when I began to think about what we're doing here today, I remembered the sorrow and the grief of this city. And I reflect that in a seafaring community, it is always well known that no ship is unsinkable, and the great adventure of travel and trade is not without cost.
This is the Southampton Memorial to the engineers of the Titanic, the men who kept the lights burning to the last, who stood to their posts, and who to a man died on April the 15th, 1912.
I'd like to tell you about this particular brochure. It was commissioned by the Institute of Marine Engineers Guild of Benevolence for this particular anniversary, the 80th anniversary. Now, the Guild of Benevolence is probably the only sort of direct link of any charity with the Titanic. And when all 36 engineers in the Titanic lost their lives on that terrible night, one of the newspapers at the time, I think it was the Daily Chronicle, decided that they would raise funds for the widows and orphans of the engineers who perished. And of course newspapers cannot continually do this, they have other things to do, and they asked the Institute of Marine Engineers would they kindly take the whole thing on. So for 80 years our institute has been helping all the dependents of not only the Titanic but the ones that followed on. And we are very proud of this tradition. It is a wonderful, wonderful tradition. If it hadn't been for the engineers, there would have been no lights all the period after, you know, the iceberg and things like that. And they kept the lights, for example, in particular, and not only lights, but other services going. Can you imagine the panic that would have existed if all those lights had been out on that ship? And all those people, they wouldn't have known how to get out of the bowels of the ship. That had been, you know, it had been dreadful. So I think the engineers, they did an absolute marvelous job.
It's a dramatic event. It affected nearly everybody's lives, particularly here in Southampton, as well as Belfast and Liverpool and London. And I feel that all these events, which wouldn't have happened probably if the ship had been 15 seconds later or 15 seconds earlier, would never have occurred. I mean, the lookout man eventually committed suicide. There were people who ran away to start new lives in America. All this makes a story. So with the 1,500 people who perished, you have 1,500 stories, and those who remained, they have stories to tell.
Well, although I've never had my father, and I never knew what he looked like, I've always loved him. And it was the Worcester Evening News. There was a picture of three men that lived in Worcestershire that went down on the Titanic, and one of those was my father. And I was 78 years. And when I was looking through it, I was looking at my dad, and I said, and I couldn't stop crying. I couldn't read for crying. I was glad I had my lunch first, and I'd gone 78 years and didn't know what he looked like. Well, I'm impressed, very impressed by the younger generation, most impressed.
I think it's just the whole story of the Titanic, that it was the best or the greatest, the famous liner of the world, and so it's the 80th anniversary, so we came here to celebrate it and to talk, to introduce ourselves, ask questions, talk. talk, to introduce ourselves, ask questions, talk to people, to the survivors.
I find it fascinating how they found it and the ship, how it is at the moment, and I just went straight into history. I asked questions, and I went to see people, wrote to people, and I got letters from Dr. Ballard and some of the survivors, and I just got into it from then.
I'm interested in all the ifs and the buts and things. If it had have gone on time, if the Olympic and the Hawke hadn't collided, it would have gone on time. If the Titanic had collided with the New York, it would have stopped her on time. If Captain Smith hadn't gone so fast, or if this ship, which was in the area, had turned on the wireless and found out. I like all the ifs and buts and all the mystique about it.
It's just really fascinating. There's just some kind of a hidden aspect of it that's really addictive, and once you're interested, you can't get away from it, and there's no kind of like verbal explanation for what it is. It's just there, and you can't get away from it once you know it.
I'm interested in the mysteries connected with the Titanic, and also on the technical side of the ship and of the people. It was the end of an era, the Victorian era.
I think perhaps it was the start of an era as well. They introduced new shipping rules and regulations. I think it was a start and an end.
It was a symbol of the era, of the luxury, the lifestyle. It was a plaything for the rich. And man was so safe, so secure and so sure of himself. And that's why the Titanic disaster caused the shock and the ripple across the world that it did. Nothing else has ever equaled it. And all that building, all that work, and in one night she was gone. And it will never happen again. The world will never see the like again of the Titanic.
What does remain? To give us an impression of the luxury and importance of this great ship. This is Alnwick in Northumberland, England, and this is the White Swan Hotel. It contains the complete first-class lounge from the Titanic's sister ship, Olympic, and gives us probably the best remaining impression of the Titanic's luxury. The first-class lounge was on Promenade Deck A. A contemporary writer said it was a noble apartment in the Louis XV style, the details being taken from the palace at Versailles. Here, passengers will indulge in reading, conversation, cards, tea drinking, and other social intercourse. The room has a length of 59 feet and a breadth of 63 feet, and a height of no less than 12 feet 3 inches. The walls are decorated with finely carved boiseries in which, without interfering with the symmetry of the whole, the fancy of the carver has shown itself in ever-varying detail. This staircase is also from the Olympic. And even the hotel's revolving door.
Now, when Titanic sank, as I said before, entrepreneurs were very quick to cash in on all kinds of things. Now, this is a so-called Titanic rivet. It's actually engraved on the top, SS Titanic 1911, lost 14th of April 1912. Now the gentleman I bought this from, who was an antique dealer, his father bought it for him, and his father was a survivor of Titanic. I didn't know this until I'd sent the cheque off, and he phoned up to acknowledge the cheque, and I just happened to say, where did it come from? And it turned out his father actually was a survivor. We have the name, and it checks up with the crew list. So presumably he just bought it to remind himself of how lucky he was to escape. When Titanic sailed, most of her facilities were free, except for things like the Turkish or electric bath. This is an actual ticket from the Titanic to admit the bearer to the baths for 4 shillings, which is 20p, or $1 US. Going down to 3rd class, this is what we think is a butter pat. It's not from Titanic, but it's identical to those used on Titanic. 3rd class china usually was very poor quality. This is almost like an earthenware. And the same with this coffee pot. Rather large, probably 3rd class, because the 1st class ones would have been much smaller, much neater. And in all probability, a lot of them were china. But a very nice piece again, same date. Now this beautiful, I think it's a soup tureen, or a sauce tureen, with its ladle, all stamped white star line. It isn't from Titanic, but it is actually dated 1910. So the odds are, well, in fact we know that these were identical to those actually used on the ship. Now this turquoise pattern cup and saucer is here, actually came from Titanic. They were taken off Titanic during her stay in Southampton by a visitor. I won't say a crew member, I don't know who took it off. But anyway, these two are actually date marked with the Titanic's batch number, as is this piece here. This piece also was taken off, unfortunately, and we haven't seen the cup for it. It's a beautiful thing. It's 1st class, top quality, Copeland Spode, and all the outside is gold leaf. These items, the same pattern as these items, were retrieved from the bottom of the sea when the French did the dive on her in 1987.
This 80th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic has been really quite extraordinary. There have been thousands of us remembering the Titanic, but in reality, how many of us actually remember her at all? How many of us have actually ever seen her? So what's going on here is not a personal, actual remembrance of the ship, but more of a remembrance of a story, of a myth, of a legend, which has been passed on from person to person, from generation to generation, from year to year. And the interesting thing about that is, while personal memory of an event fades with every passing year, the memory of the Titanic seems to have got stronger and bigger every time it's been retold.
We've come down here to participate, take part in this convention, to take part, as I say, in a bit of history, but to remember it all. And possibly also a time to remember that we shouldn't make such silly comments as Unsinkable, but also hearing a lot of what's been going on over the weekend. Perhaps it's high time we stopped looking for someone to blame. We don't want any more mudraking, any more fault finding, and perhaps we don't want the Titanic disturbing anymore, do you think?